and I'm going to make a semi-promise that one of these days I'm going to get a better camera, learn how to edit things, and not just make crappy videos of me talking. They're really low res and poor quality. I do have a new laptop. Maybe I'll move it to that and try that out. So I wanted to speak very briefly on a character that keeps coming up in personal discussion. He shows up in my newsfeed a lot, probably because I listen to political opinions on Islam and radical Islam and Western culture. But I have to say, he's a man I've had very little interest in reading. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, so much of what he says about neuroscience I don't really know how to respond to, and that's Sam Harris. I'll read Hitchens, I'll read Dawkins, I'll read Dennett, and the other three of the Four Horsemen. But Harris I've just not really found that interesting, or that intelligent. And part of the problem is he sounds humble, but at the same time, and that's kind of maybe a psychological trick, right? This low speaking, kind of low tone gets you to trust him more than when people act freaked out by what he says. Because the people that sound freaked out don't sound as trustworthy, right? It's a psychological kind of game, potentially. So I'm not going to comment on his work on free will. There's actually a Greek Orthodox Archdiocese video by another neuroscientist who takes umbrage with what he says in that book, so it would be interesting to read that and listen to the talk. But like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychologist, so... But some of what he's said need to be challenged for a few reasons. Now, much of Islam in the world politically, I would argue that he is right in some ways, that it is cultural stagnation in many locations, not all, but many locations, that the positions they hold as a majority based on surveys do tend to fall into the realm of what the West would call extreme views that are not Western friendly. So from the standpoint of the majority of Islamic countries and people, he is correct. Now, here's where he's just an idiot, and he's wrong. And as a neurologist speaking on history and philosophy, he needs to stop before he hurts himself. He's got to check himself because he's wrecked himself a few times. Many of his followers, of course, don't think that because many of the new atheists bow down to anyone who they like almost with this divine fervor. And I don't really care if you disagree with that statement. I've seen it firsthand. I've got a good friend of mine who fell away from the faith, and he loves Dawkins, and he was very upset when I read chapter 4 of The God Delusion and said that's the worst argument I've ever heard for. His argument was divine complexity, and how divine complexity argues that there is no God. He also argues that natural selection, apparently, can give you everything, when natural selection, by the very definition of it and its operation, is a conserving process. It doesn't actually write the natural laws, right? It only basically conserves within the constraints of natural law, like gravity or the general law of relativity. So in that regard, the book is just, it's crazy, the sheer amount of power he gives natural selection is just not possible. So he treats it almost like a deus ex machina, like this kind of, it will solve all problems, which I think he needs to tell most physicists that, because I think that they're still looking for this universal equation, and maybe he must have found it. Right. So the problem I have with Harris is he's made claims that, and I've listened to part of his podcast, you can listen to it on YouTube, and he says, most people when they talk about the Islamic Golden Age say that they preserved Aristotle. And he talks about how bad Aristotle was to science. Again, not quite putting on his thinking cap historically or developmentally, he just comes at it from a today perspective and says, well, they withheld, they held back scientific discovery. The dumb ass doesn't realize that most people back then not only were religious, they were the ones that did the scientific discoveries. What is he going to do, go to Isaac Newton and call him a moron for believing in God, even though he developed calculus? I mean, even Neil deGrasse Tyson's not that arrogant, So the arrogance is just astounding, and the ignorance is astounding. Okay, first and foremost, the Islamic Golden Age did not just preserve Aristotle. All right, if that were the case, we would have no constituted theologians and philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Ghazali, all of these different thinkers, As-Suwardi, all of these different thinkers in different empires were. And we know who they are because they actually didn't just preserve Aristotle, they commented on him. And those comments actually still affect philosophy today. There's a, I can't remember if it's Philosophy Bites, it's out of Britain, and they get different people to talk about different things. And there's one, I believe, that's on modern approaches using Averroism, from Averroes, the Muslim philosopher who existed in Moorish Spain, and who later on had to flee Spain due to a changeover in who was in charge in the Moorish community. But his work profoundly influenced Latin Christianity and Latin philosophy in the Western world, and still does. Specifically, some of those things affect elements like logic, computer science. For him to say that the Islamic Golden Age did not develop modern medicine is astounding, which it did. It developed modern freaking medicine that had been lost. I mean, we are still defining in some ways medicine that the ancients practiced. So for them to come up with modern medicine after a break from the ancient Romans is impressive. Because the ancient Romans were, by the way, doing eye surgery. We found out that we've actually found elements that demonstrate that they were doing like cataract surgery practically. We weren't able to do that until like 50 years ago or 60 years ago. So, it's it's just an arrogance about this assumed forward progress of society, that it never has regressions, it never has problems, from a guy who frankly also is arguing against social justice warriors and regressive leftism. If you're arguing against something within your own culture and then arguing against something in another culture, there's a reason Jesus said take the plank out of your eye, from a cultural perspective at least. The fact is, they're talking about, why people would become extremists or radicals. And I've made a comment a little bit before that, it's not even so much, everyone talks about economy and education because they think that's the main thing. But the reality is many people in Islamic countries look at the West with horror. I mean, they get our daytime television, right? They get people that sleep around, that have problems with relationships, and it might be cute and funny on a sitcom, but in reality, if people are actually going through that, it's not really funny. It's tragic. We make it lighthearted, but they see that and they actually think that that's us, in the same way that we look at our news and think that that's always them. So, they didn't just retain Aristotle and put him in like a safe deposit box, like they never looked at him or developed his thought or followed in that fine mindset, or even challenged him, oddly enough. Similar to how maybe you might challenge him if you were a philosopher. But that's Sam, ignoring history like crazy. Like I said to someone on one of his a channel that lauded him, I said, it'd be interesting to have him talk to Peter Adamson from the History of Philosophy podcast, and who is a specialist in philosophy in the Islamic world, and just see how they go about it, doing it together, because I'm pretty confident Peter Adamson is an atheist too, potentially. He's not really said his religious convictions, so he made a comment about really taking religion seriously when studying philosophy. So my hunch is he's an atheist. But he made it, I think he'd mop the floor with Harris, and it has nothing to do with lies. It has to do with actually knowing historical documentation, knowing the development of different cultural mindsets, etc. Right? So Al-Ghazali's occasionalism, and I teach this in my class when I get to Islam, that Al-Ghazali's occasionalism unfortunately held more sway, which, if you don't know what occasionalism is, it's a singular cause to things. And the single cause for him was the will of God. So if you have the will of God as a singular cause, you cannot have then natural law or human freedom. God is the only one that's truly free. Averroes disagreed with Al-Ghazali and defended the elements of causation from Aristotle. And so as a result, there's a counter to him, which allows science to exist. Because if your science is influenced by Al-Ghazali, you're going to see, two atoms of hydrogen combine with one atom of oxygen to form water if Allah wills. Okay, there's not this concept of secondary causes, not this concept of natural law that exists kind of independently of God's will, yet upheld by it, because God is rational, right? You don't have that in Al-Ghazali's take. If he really was an occasionalist, his followers seem to be, or at least seem to interpret him that way. The more you have that understanding, the more you can appreciate where these cultures have gone, and for Harris to view things in that regard is not only not helpful for dialogue with Muslims that aren't violent, who do want to have their religion adjusted. It's just not fair to history. We can have discussions about whether Muhammad was, violent or not. History seems to show that he was not necessarily the nicest man. But again, that's also why I don't call him the prophet. Right? I don't believe he was one. Okay, if I did, I'd call him that. In the same way that many people who don't believe Jesus was the Messiah or was a Messiah, they don't call him the Christ. Shocking. Being true to my convictions when I'm actually being open to discussing something like this. Strange. So is what I'm talking about being left-wing? No, it's being rational and being a scholar of something. Something more than just thinking everything can be whittled down to scientific reductionism. Because it can't, right? Every time Harris has been challenged on ethics, for example, William Lane Craig did it in a debate with Harris, fairly long-windedly, but the effect was the same. And a college student actually asked him this question. When Harris makes an argument, you can see this in much of his talk. When he makes an argument, it is within his own culture, within his own understanding, and within his own perception of what is and is not good. And so he goes after low-hanging fruit from the perception where, well, yes, most people would believe throwing acid in people's faces is wrong. Except, of course, in cultures where they think it's okay. And even then, those are often, I think, seen more as deviant behaviors than the norm. But okay, let's grant that we can all agree that it's wrong. And so he says, well, instead of having, religion or ethics, or, even ethics non-scientifically, you have to have a scientific theory or thesis of ethics about human well-being. Okay, that's vague. It's begging the question, right? What is well-being? Well-being of the individual? Well-being of the community? What happens when one individual's well-being influences another's? Right? What if my well-being, which is held in high esteem, can be benefited from me getting more money? Why all of a sudden do I have to worry about this other asshole over here who doesn't have as much? Right? Can he just go and play in the flowers and increase his well-being while I increase my money? Right? I mean, so even what increases well-being is not necessarily known. He wants to put it, of course, towards mental states because that's what he studies, and he thinks that's the end-all, be-all of existence because he wants to be an expert on everything. His view of how science works, I think, is equally flawed, as are many people who are new atheists, right? So that's my Sam Harris rant. I just think the man begs the question. He does not develop a coherent understanding of what well-being is. He is not careful with his terminology because he's never been a philosopher or someone who actually has to do ethics, right? Or someone who actually has to deal with reality, I think, outside of academia. Most people in academia, I think, need to be mentally looked at anyway because they spend most of their time in the ivory tower applying theories without having to really look at facts half the time. But as far as his followers go, I'm sure there are intelligent followers out there who agree with him on a certain basis, but just very briefly in the last 2 minutes I've got here. If you think that modern science is anything akin to we can empirically demonstrate things, and anyone who believes in supernaturalism is just acting on faith, and whereas we act on reason, you're deluding yourself. If that were the case, then I should be able to demonstrate to you that the Higgs boson exists. Now, I do not have the finances, the experience, the knowledge, or the cyclotron in my ass pocket to pull out and demonstrate that to you. Okay? That's not how science works anymore. Science has to make money, or it can't be done, because it can't get funded. Okay? So it's very much tied to what makes money. In addition, you have a lot of scientists that are also educators, and they are often very busy. You can often follow something like Retraction Watch and see what's retracted in scientific journals. What experiment was not actually done? What was fudged? Do peer reviewers actually look at your stuff? Very carefully, right? Is that a faith you have in them? You have faith and authority for a lot of things in science. A lot. And while you might fit within your metaphysic, the argument that you're following it not on faith, especially on blind faith, because how many people actually know the physics behind the Higgs boson? I'm guaranteeing you most people who believe in it on the popular level don't know dick about it. Okay? That's equally an aspect of faith. So, again, know how science actually works, and then get back to us on why Harris is right and everyone is wrong. That'd be wonderful. Until then, use your brain, think for yourself, and realize that there are some things you just take on faith because you have to. Life's too short to do everything.